Welcome to Forum 360 on Fusion, your PBS channel. I am Ben Rancman, your host today. Thank you for joining us for a global outlook with a local view. Northeast Ohio is known for its dynamic classical music scene. Of course, this includes such renowned organizations as the Cleveland Orchestra and the Cleveland Institute of Music, but there are a number of music conservatories in the region and an array of musicians, chamber ensembles, choral concerts being performed at any given time. My guest here today is Zsolt Bognar. He's a local musician making an impact on the Northeast Ohio musical scene. In addition to being an acclaimed concert pianist, Mr. Bognar is also the artistic director and general manager of music from the Western Reserve, a chamber music series. He is also the host of a series, Living the Classical Life, exploring the world of classical music and musicians. So welcome, Zsolt. Thank you very much for joining us today on Forum 360.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about really the super dynamic arts and culture and musical scene here in Northeast Ohio.
Very good. Yes, we're oftentimes very spoiled. So I think we were talking about this earlier today about the depth of the talent that really is here in town.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I actually came here to Ohio is the Cleveland Institute of Music, which really draws on faculty that's derived from members of the Cleveland Orchestra, prominent performers who have also found their base here. But I really came here to study because of Sergei Babayan, who at that time was approximately, and this is a humbling thing to think about, he was approximately the age that I am now when I came here to start studying with him. And so I was lucky that at that time he didn't actually have so many concerts as he has now. So I had lessons all the time. That was great for me as a developing pianist and musician, that I could basically have 3 or 4 lessons per week, each of those lessons being about 3 hours long. So it was really the foundation and structure of my entire life, and that was so exciting. A small studio of aspiring pianists and performers. We were all just practicing buddies, and there was our teacher who has now become one of the most famous in the world. And here I was in Cleveland. I didn't realize, because at first I thought, well, what is this Cleveland? You know, that's just, you know,
Where are you from originally, actually?
Okay, so I'm from Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, which is another instance of what's that. It's
but it's a university town.
It is a university of, yes, University of Illinois, where my father teaches architectural design, actually.
Okay.
It's where I was born, it's where I was raised, and went to a performing arts boarding school in Boston.
Okay, which one?
Walnut Hill School for the Performing Arts, and I was just reminded this past week that I am coming up this year on my 20th year reunion. So it's amazing to consider that time has flown that quickly, but for me, it's a reminder that I've also built a lot of different projects in my life, for which I'm really grateful.
Wow, beautiful. I have to say that I managed to catch your piece on TED Med, and I listened to that Schubert performance, and I have to tell you, as someone who has a pretty extensive musical background, not anywhere remotely close to where you're at, when I listened to it, and I listened to the expressiveness and the technical, really virtuosity, it just makes me realize how much of a gap there is in my own performance. And I'm so rusty at this point, but I did, speaking of the Cleveland Institute of Music, you know, I would go there multiple times per week as a child, and music and piano performance in particular, a particularly important part of my life. Went to Interlaken actually for summer camp, but it's really something that I think, as someone who was sort of raised in a classical music environment, I have the ability to appreciate it. And I'd love to speak with you about ways of sort of bringing this art form, this really remarkable art form, to a broader audience. I think it's so critical. Just going back, can you tell me a little bit about you growing up and your background in piano and music? When did you begin?
Absolutely. Yeah. So piano, it came to me rather late. So I was almost 9 when I started piano.
Okay.
A lot of times young performers will already be veterans of the concert stage by that time, but the idea was mine. I grew up in a house where there was certainly an appreciation for arts, but we didn't have, for example, a piano in the house. My father's mother in Hungary had been a piano teacher. She studied at the Liszt Academy with Ernst von Dohnányi. It's an amazing detail. Béla Bartók was in the building at the time.
Goodness.
So there really was a tradition of the arts and appreciation. So my piano appreciation was also there. But at some point, my older brother started flute lessons at the Conservatory or University of Illinois in Urbana. And my mom would take us there, and I'd wait as he would have his lessons in the grand hall. And the organ majors were practicing there. And I said, wow, that's a magnificent, magnificent instrument. I want to do that too. They said, okay, well, you start out on piano. So I did that with my first piano teacher, Roger Shields, who is a fantastic influence in my life. But I like to say kind of that I was tricked into playing piano.
Okay.
That became, you know,
I
I
think
wanted
that's
to.
compulsory with students in music. I mean, you have to trick them and sometimes cajole them into practicing. And
Oh, absolutely. You have to have your keyboard skills. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
I had parents who were really hands-off. But my dad started to see that I had some love of what I was doing. And so he started to say, well, 2 hours north of here, this was Urbana, there's Chicago and there's Orchestra Hall, and they have a great pianists concert series. Why don't we start driving up there for their Sunday matinee concerts? So I would hear Alfred Brendel, Kristen Zimmerman, Ivo Pogorelic, artists who I had admired growing up in collecting their recordings. But it was really one particular concert of Alfred Brendel. He presented, I believe it was 4 or 5 Beethoven sonatas. And I thought, okay, there's this great, grand, romanticized German master. Here he is. And even at that age of about 11 or 12, 2 years into my own piano studies, I felt like this was a revelation of philosophical thought through music, through emotional impact, and even sort of a witty humor that he was able to convey somehow through these Beethoven sonatas. At that age, I was not familiar with them. But I remember he ended with the D major sonata, the number 7, opus 10, number 3. There's this light, whimsical little gesture. It doesn't seem like an ending of a piece at all, after which he made this gesture and swept his hands off the keyboard. The women in the audience started kind of snickering with delight, giggling. And I thought, well, if there's room for humor on the classical music stages, I wonder what else is possible. There's this full range of life experiences that you can convey through music. And that was the moment I decided to become a musician. It wasn't really a conscious decision. I just felt like that's where I want to be. So at that point, I started saying, well...
So at 11 years old, you were committed to a career in music.
Yes, I just really didn't know what else there was. I also had this huge passion for airplanes and flight simulators. So I thought at some point that I would be a pilot, but eventually my way to soar was through music. So those were my beginnings in music.
And then, of course, you went to the Cleveland Institute of Music in Cleveland. And tell us a little bit about that. You mentioned Sergei Babayan.
Absolutely. Well, that really brings us to the question of where are we in Cleveland on the global musical map? Well, the Cleveland Institute of Music has produced a lot of very prominent graduates. Probably the most notable at this point would be Daniel Trifonov, who was also a classmate of mine, same teacher, Sergei Babayan. But the history of the Institute, for example, Bartók, who we had mentioned earlier, had accepted the presidency of CIM right before he died. Unfortunately, it didn't pan out that way. But we do have the association with the Cleveland Orchestra, which at the time that I came to the school, I thought, well, I didn't really know that we could go there on a daily, weekly basis to hear these concerts. That formed the basis of my education, really. And if we look at the artistic...
Wonderful artistic incubator there in University Circle, remarkable.
Well, that's right. And also, I think we had been discussing this the other day, that the per capita arts support in this region is one of the highest in the country. And that is something that I am very well aware of, as I appreciate the fact that we have the Cleveland Museum of Art. We have art museums in the region, and we also have these regional concert series. There's the Cleveland Chamber Music Society, and then there's music from the Western Reserve, which I've just taken over. So There are a lot of ways to connect this community. There are a lot of ways to, I mean, I don't know how it is for you, but I feel like on any given night, there are at least 3 or 4 different events to choose from. So it's
routinely, it's an embarrassment of riches. And there's, I mean, I have been to so many wonderful shows, different chamber. We have, there's Apollo's Fire, different smaller ensembles, competitions of various sorts. I mean, there's always something of a very high caliber happening on a regular basis here in Cleveland. It's really wonderful.
So the question that you brought up earlier, which was how do we reach a wider audience? This is a continually evolving question. How do we, okay, so if I'm thinking about music from the Western Reserve, how do we reach our broadest audience, especially when our concerts are being offered to our student target audience? It's being offered for free. How do we make people aware that the message of music is compelling and relevant to our lives today? Especially if we're performing the music that's written, say, 200 or 300 years ago. What does that level of expressivity say to our lives today? Where that kind of thing isn't.
It's a great challenge. I mean, I know many people, and I think there's an initial difficulty challenge with classical music in particular because it's very different from the expectations I think set forth in a sort of a popular music, where the song's going to be 2 to 3 minutes. There's going to be a hook. It's going to be very short. I think in some ways a person really has to sort of listen in a very open manner in a musical form that is a much more long form. I think, for example, I went to a Cleveland Orchestra concert with my wife just recently, and I have a classical music background, and I think for some people they have, as we say in my family, we have spielkas. You kind of, it was difficult for her to stay for 45 minutes for an hour, and I think sometimes people, I think have to learn to sort of just relax and accept this particular music for what it is. They're trying to project a sort of popular culture onto it, and it is a challenge to cross those generations.
Well, if you think of it, in today's society, in our lives, what other experiences fosters the need to sit there quietly, give total undivided attention, and foster a state of wonder? I'm not really sure that there's anything else that's comparable. However, with what's being absorbed, there is so much that requires at least a little bit of context. Audiences in this country may have a really deep and passionate following for music without necessarily the same hundreds of years of concert-going tradition that, say, Europe has. However, I think that this can be opened in terms of a door of that experience by providing more intimate experiences, a smaller concert series where we will start out, and this is one thing that we've started with Hudson, is an opportunity to have an on-stage pre-concert chat conversation with the musicians, a little bit about their lives, what they're trying to communicate with this music, and a little bit of a rundown of the music itself.
Really an essential component. I think that sometimes just a little bit of information about the piece itself, when it was written, what the context was, perhaps in some instances what the particular inspiration was, and then of course to get the artist's perspective, I think it adds just another dimension and an increased level of accessibility to audiences. I think that really helps interpret this music for people, lay people who might not have that deep exposure to classical music, well, and even those who do.
Absolutely, because look, this is really about connection. This is about communication. So the average concert goer will understand that, okay, this is a Beethoven sonata. We know that this is supposed to be great, but how do we really listen to that? So if we have a sense that what's being given to us musically is not being talked down to, it's not a condescending experience, this is not a museum piece in a way, because look, we are not...
People forget that this was the popular music of its day.
Yes, and in some cases, I mean, in Beethoven's case, if we're going with Beethoven, these were sometimes shocking experiences that were not even the mainstay of, Beethoven came on the Viennese Society upon this scene, and people were really shocked by his manner and the music and the bold statement that it was trying to make. So
and even how he has a personality. I mean, this musician who, to the best of my knowledge, he was operating independently as a musician, very different from the, most musicians were court musicians or church musicians, and had to have some sort of particular post and position, and he somehow was able to manage a level of independence that up to that point had not really been so common at all.
That's absolutely the case. And so what I've always tried to take it upon myself to do, in the various hats that I wear loosely in my musical life, whether it be as a performer at the piano, whether it be the host of my film series, Living the Classical Life, whether it be the presenter at Music from the Western Reserve here in Hudson, I like to foster the sense that the performers are human beings and we are sharing something worth saying. And so it's a question of letting the audience know as to the why it's important.
Beautiful.
So that's what I've been trying to do.
I just want to take this opportunity to let you know that my name is Ben Rancman. This is Forum 360. I'm speaking with Zsolt Bognar here of a variety of different hats that he wears. He, of course, Music from the Western Reserve here in Hudson is a musical series that he is the artistic director and manager for. He is also a remarkable classical pianist himself, and just a variety of different hats that you wear. It's really great how much you really invested. And you're like one of these people that really helps make this artistic ecosystem in Northeast Ohio so wonderful. You really bring your talents to bear in a variety of different ways in the music scene here. It's great.
Well, thank you for that. I feel lucky. Maybe at this point, I'm still trying to understand how these different hats have evolved and trying to find a balance in my life where it can all work and I can actually be productive in all the different capacities. But I think at this point, where my show, Living the Classical Life, for people who are not familiar with this actually started out as a totally accidental project. So about 10 years ago, some of my friends, and actually my German language teacher at Case, decided that she and her husband wanted to do something to help me as a performer. And I said, well, do you have a website? And I said, well, no, I don't. I said, well, we should probably put one together for you. So let's think of who can do that for you. And let's also maybe replicate something that we've seen at the Oberlin Conservatory faculty web pages, where you go there and you see, okay, there's a little 3 to 5 minute video about each of the faculty members. They say, hi, I'm so-and-so. This is what I'm about. This is what I'm doing. In some cases, they'll play a little bit. So get to know the performer. So they said, why don't we do something like that for you? We'll film a little something, and we can put that on the front page of your homepage. I said, okay, well, that sounds fine. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. So at that time, I was really uncomfortable in front of the camera. We had it so that this film production crew based in New York came into my apartment, and then I had to somehow show something about myself. Well, I said, I'm not really, what am I supposed to prove to the viewer? I'm really uncomfortable with this notion. But we started filming me interacting with my musical friends and colleagues. And then that started morphing into my natural curiosity for other people and the way they live their musical lives. And I thought, well, okay, so I grew up watching various interview shows. One of them being Inside the Actors Studio with James Lipton, who has recently passed away. I became interested in how people develop not just their craft within their given field, but why they do what they do. What is their passion? What is motivating their life force? Understanding how they overcame their personal challenges, their doubts, and rose closer towards their dreams. And that can apply to all of us in whatever we are doing in life. And that's what interests me. So my curiosity about those types of human interest stories, I said, I want to know that. It's almost like therapy, really. So,
well, there's just got to be a great deal that goes into the inner mind, the workings, the career of a musician. I think that many of us who experience and enjoy this art form really might not know everything that goes into the daily life of being a really being a professional classical musician. I mean, there are real challenges, real excitements. I mean, a great deal of competition. I always, my brother, he took piano even a little further than me. He was a piano performance major and an engineering student at Case. And ultimately, both of those were so taxing, he had to drop one, and he dropped piano, of course. But and he's an engineer now. You know,
That's what we musicians call a real job.
A real
where
job.
We're guaranteed a paycheck.
Yeah, a real job. But the ability to make a living as a classical musician is exceedingly difficult. I always compare it to somebody, you know, you might be a really good basketball player, but your likelihood of actually making a living at this is very difficult. And you know, it's a challenging world, and you know, you've made it work in many ways. And you know, but it's interesting to hear how musicians deal with the competition, the lack of performance opportunities, particularly early on in their careers. And I watched some of those pieces, and that really resonated with me. That you know, particularly you had a recent interview in New York, and you know, the amount of talent that is in New York, and your ability to regularly get gigs that you know to be able to perform is difficult.
Well, absolutely. So. Okay, so the show concerns musicians mostly. And we've had people like Joshua Bell, violinist, Joyce DiDonato, singer. We had the living legend Vladimir Ashkenazy, who became famous as a pianist and conductor. I grew up collecting his recordings. We talk about...
I had a few as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's just, I mean, he really recorded everything. The question is, okay, so they're talking about their craft in music and finding their artistic voice. But really what interests me is more generally in life, how do we as human beings identify what we believe we can bring to this world, and what is our passion, and how do we get there? So that's really what I'm trying to do through my show. You mentioned the TED Talk. Well, this was actually a focus on wellness. And so I was comparing the life of Schubert, who had many issues with his health.
Yes, yeah, he died quite a young man.
Yes, 31. Imagine that. I'm older than 31 now.
What's really shocking and almost embarrassing is how accomplished he was at such a remarkably young age.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we talked earlier about what it's like to be in the concert hall these days, where ideally you will not be on your cell phone, where you have, you know, what are we used to seeing? We are used to multitasking. We are used to seeing the info bars go across the bottom of the screen. But to really focus on something, that is something. So anyway, the point about Schubert is there wasn't Facebook back then. There wasn't Twitter. You had the absolute focus and devotion towards your craft. So he maybe had a little bit more time to devote to that sort of thing. Well, what does that teach us? Well, maybe a little bit more focus on what we love.
Yeah, and there's just something remarkable. I mean, I've spoken with many people, and some could have religious views, some could have avowedly secular views, and you could look at life through a position of evolutionary biology. But the one conundrum to me always is music. What is the evolutionary advantage? I don't understand what it might be. This is really sort of an expression of, for lack of a better word, the human soul trying to connect with something beyond itself. It's really remarkable if you really think about just the entire enterprise of music. And in classical music, I think you do have that long form, the ability to really sort of sit and reflect over an extended period of time. It's a very spiritual experience in my
well, I certainly think so. I mean, people like to use buzzwords and buzz phrases like music is the universal language. Well, I mean, maybe, but what does that really mean? You have to put the people together. You have to put the performer there, and you have to put the audience there. You have to have the performer have something really compelling to say. You have to have the audience understand why it's important to be there. So that's really the job of many people, to put that together. So I'm using my various hats as ways to put that all together. I'm really grateful at this point in my life that the visibility of my TED Talk, the visibility of my show, which has accidentally become really famous, as a way to put other people together for their mutual benefit. And I'm really, really lucky for that.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Zsolt. We are incredibly lucky to have such a dynamic and vibrant classical music scene here in Northeast Ohio. The abundance of choices are truly made possible by a cadre of dedicated performers and professionals. Zsolt Bognar has done a remarkable job, not only as an incredibly expressive pianist, but his work with music from the Western Reserve and his thoughtful series, Living the Classical Life. He is truly one of the lights in our classical music firmament here in Northeast Ohio. I'm Ben Rancman, your host today. Thank you for joining us on Forum 360, sponsored by the Knight and Akron Community Foundations on Fusion, your PBS channel.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.